Everyone knew Glenn Ford was serious about being fast. The star of the fastest gun alive didn't just play quick-draw champions, he claimed to be one. But what happened when Dean Martin casually drew his gun in 0.19 seconds didn't just humble a legend. It turned Hollywood's cockiest gunfighter into the quietest man on the lot. By 1965, Ford had built a reputation as Hollywood's most technically proficient gunfighter, and he wasn't shy about it. He'd tell anyone who'd listen that his 0.38-second draw was unbeatable, that real gunfighters from the Old West would have been impressed. But on a humid afternoon at Columbia Pictures, Ford made the mistake of bragging to the wrong man. The Main Street set at Columbia Pictures was buzzing with activity that September afternoon. 3 different Western productions were sharing the sprawling frontier town, with actors, crew members, and equipment moving between the false front buildings like pieces on a giant chessboard. The air was thick with dust and the smell of hot wood baking in the California sun. Glenn Ford was holding court near the saloon facade, surrounded by a small crowd of admirers that included several younger actors, a few journalists, and most of the crew from his current production. At 49, Ford was at the peak of his career and his confidence. He'd just finished filming a challenging quick-draw sequence for The Rage at Dawn, and he was in the mood to demonstrate why he considered himself the undisputed king of Hollywood gunplay. The thing most people don't understand, Ford was saying, gesturing with the custom Colt 45 he carried in an elaborately tooled holster, is that real quick-draw isn't about fancy moves or showboating. It's about pure speed and accuracy, getting steel on target faster than your opponent can think. The crowd nodded appreciatively. Ford's reputation for technical expertise was well established. Unlike many actors who learned just enough gunplay to look convincing on screen, Ford had studied with real frontier veterans and practiced religiously. His personal collection of period weapons was legendary, and his knowledge of Western history was encyclopedic. "How fast are we talking, Mr. Ford?" asked one of the younger actors, a newcomer who'd landed a small role in Ford's current picture. Ford smiled with the confidence of a man who'd answered this question many times. "My personal best is 38/100ths of a second from leather to target. That's faster than Wild Bill Hickok, faster than John Wesley Hardin, faster than any of the legendary gunfighters from the real frontier days." There were murmurs of appreciation from the crowd. 38/100ths of a second was indeed impressive, fast enough to be genuinely dangerous if Ford had been carrying a loaded weapon. "In fact," Ford continued, warming to his favorite subject, "I'd be willing to bet that no actor in Hollywood can draw faster than that. Maybe no one, period. Speed like that comes from years of dedicated practice, and frankly, most entertainers don't have the discipline for that kind of commitment." It was then that a familiar voice cut through the afternoon air with quiet amusement. "That's a hell of a claim, Glenn. What Dean Martin did next would shock everyone on that set. But before we get to that incredible moment, you need to understand just how confident Glenn Ford really was." The crowd turned to see Dean Martin approaching from the direction of the commissary, a coffee cup in one hand and his trademark relaxed smile on his face. Dean was dressed casually in slacks and a polo shirt, looking more like he was headed to a golf course than a movie set. Ford's smile widened. He'd known Dean for years, and while he respected him as an entertainer, he'd never considered him serious competition in the technical aspects of Western acting. "Dino," Ford called out enthusiastically, "just the man I wanted to see. I was telling these folks about the difference between real gunfighting skills and movie make-believe. You've done some Westerns. Tell them what it's like working with authentic period weapons versus the lightweight props most actors use." Dean took a sip of his coffee and studied Ford thoughtfully. "Authentic weapons, huh? That's important, I suppose, though I've always found that the tool matters less than the person using it." Ford laughed, missing the subtle edge in Dean's voice. "Come on, Dean. You know as well as I do that there's a difference between actors who just point and shoot for the cameras and those of us who've actually mastered the skills we're portraying." "Those of us who've mastered the skills," Dean repeated slowly. "That's an interesting way to put it." The crowd sensed something shift in the conversation's tone. Ford, caught up in his own enthusiasm, pressed on. "I mean, no disrespect to entertainers like yourself, But when you're playing a gunfighter, audiences can tell the difference between someone who's just acting and someone who actually knows what they're doing. My draw is 38 hundredths of a second. That's not acting. That's authentic skill. Dean finished his coffee and set the cup down on a nearby prop barrel. 38 hundredths. That is impressive, Glenn. Mind if I ask how you measure that? Electronic timer, just like they use in competitive shooting. Arvo Ohala himself verified the time. Said it was some of the finest work he'd ever seen. Arvo's a good judge, Dean agreed. Known him for years. Ford's eyes lit up. Here was an opportunity to really demonstrate his expertise in front of a Hollywood legend. You know what, Dean? Since you're here, why don't I show you what real speed looks like? Consider it a masterclass in authentic Western skills. The crowd gathered in a loose circle as Ford positioned himself in his preferred stance. He was wearing full Western gear, authentic period costume down to the hand-stitched boots. His gun belt was a museum-quality piece, the holster perfectly positioned and worn smooth from years of practice. Ford took his time settling into position, making small adjustments to his stance and explaining each element to his audience. Feet positioned for maximum stability, weight slightly forward, gun hand relaxed but ready. The key is muscle memory, doing it so many times that your body moves without conscious thought. He drew. It was undeniably impressive. Ford's hand moved with practiced precision, the gun appearing in his grip and swinging up to target position in one smooth motion. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked echoed across the set. 38 hundredths, Ford announced as he reholstered the weapon. Give or take a few hundredths depending on conditions. Not bad for an old cowboy, right, Dean? Dean nodded appreciatively. That was smooth, Glenn. Very professional. Thank you. Like I said, it comes from years of serious practice. Most actors never put in that kind of time because, frankly, they don't need to. The cameras can make anyone look fast with the right angles and editing. True, Dean agreed, though I suppose some of us do practice for our own satisfaction. Ford paused, something in Dean's tone finally registering. You practice quick draw? A little, Dean said modestly. Just enough to feel comfortable with the equipment when I'm doing Western roles. Ford's confidence returned. Here was an opportunity to be generous while reinforcing his own superiority. Well, if you ever want some pointers, I'd be happy to share what I've learned. It takes years to develop real speed, but everyone has to start somewhere. That's very kind of you, Dean said. Actually, since we're all here, would you mind if I tried one? Just to see how I compare to a real expert. Ford's smile was indulgent. Of course, but don't worry if you're not quite up to professional speed. Like I said, this takes years of dedicated practice. Dean looked around the circle of faces watching him. I should probably mention I don't have any Western gear with me today. No problem, Ford said magnanimously. You can use one of my backup rigs. It might be a little loose on you, but it'll give you the idea. Actually, Dean said, I think I've got something in my trailer. Give me just a minute. Dean walked away toward the row of star trailers, leaving Ford to bask in the admiring glances of his audience. Several people commented on his generosity in offering to help a fellow actor. His willingness to share his expertise even with someone who clearly wasn't in his league. Ford was explaining the finer points of grip tension when Dean returned, and the conversation died mid-sentence. Dean had changed into Western where that fit him like it had been made by master craftsmen, which it clearly had been. The shirt was perfectly tailored, the pants broke exactly right over handmade boots, and the gun belt was a work of art. Ford stared at Dean's equipment with the eye of a true connoisseur, and what he saw disturbed him. This wasn't costume department gear or even high-end replica equipment. This was authentic period work, modified with subtle improvements that spoke of serious study and substantial investment. That's beautiful equipment, Dean, Ford said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty for the first time that afternoon. Thank you, Dean replied simply. I had it made a few years back when I realized I was going to be doing more Westerns. As Dean settled into his stance, Ford noticed something else that made him uncomfortable. Dean's positioning wasn't that of an amateur borrowing techniques he'd seen in movies. Every element, the placement of his feet, the angle of his body, the relaxed readiness of his gun hand, spoke of extensive professional training. "Whenever you're ready," Dean said quietly. Ford raised his electronic timer, suddenly less confident about what he was about to witness. "On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." What happened next redefined Glenn Ford's understanding of what was humanly possible. Dean's hand moved. There was no other way to describe it, because calling it a draw implied a process that could be observed and broken down into component parts. But there was no process visible here. One moment Dean's hand was at his side. The next moment it was filled with steel, the weapon drawn, cocked, and aimed with surgical precision. The sound of the hammer clicking into place seemed to hang in the desert air forever. Ford stared at his electronic timer in complete disbelief. The display showed numbers that violated everything he thought he knew about human capability. 0.19 seconds. "That's..." Ford's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "That's not possible." Dean calmly holstered his weapon and adjusted his shirt sleeves. "How'd I do?" Ford looked at the timer again, as if the numbers might have changed. They hadn't. 19/100ths of a second, he said quietly. The crowd was absolutely silent. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, but the implications were still sinking in. Glenn Ford, Hollywood's self-proclaimed fastest gun, had just been outdrawn by nearly 20/100ths of a second, a margin that represented the difference between professional competence and superhuman ability. "I must have mistimed it," Ford said, his voice lacking conviction. "Let me try again." "Sure," Dean replied agreeably. Ford reset his timer with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. The cocky confidence that had characterized his entire afternoon was gone, replaced by something approaching anxiety. "Ready?" Ford asked. Dean nodded and settled back into his stance, that perfect, economical positioning that Ford was beginning to realize represented a level of training far beyond his own. "Mark!" Once again, Dean's draw was so fast it seemed to violate the laws of physics. Once again, the timer registered 0.19 seconds. And once again, Ford found himself staring at numbers that shouldn't have been possible. This time, he didn't question the equipment. "Jesus Christ, Dean," Ford whispered. "Where did you learn to do that?" Dean smiled, but it was a different smile now. Quieter, more serious. "Same place you learned your technique, Glenn. Practice. Lots and lots of practice. But the speed. I've been working on this for 15 years and you just..." "I've been working on it for about 12 years. Dean interrupted gently. "Since I realized I was going to be doing westerns and figured I should know what I was doing." The crowd around them had grown as word spread through the lot that something extraordinary was happening on the Western Street. Crew members, other actors, even a few executives had gathered to watch, drawn by rumors that someone had just demonstrated impossible speed. Ford looked around at the faces staring at him, then back at Dean. The afternoon that had started with him demonstrating his superiority had turned into a public humiliation. But worse than the embarrassment was the growing realization of what Dean's speed meant. "You've been this fast for 12 years? Ford asked. "Give or take," Dean replied. "I hit the 19/100ths mark about 3 years ago. Been working on 17/100ths lately, but that's proving stubborn." Ford felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. For 15 years, he'd built his professional identity around being Hollywood's most technically proficient Western actor. He'd given interviews about his speed, written articles about authentic gunfighting techniques, even consulted on other actors' training. And all this time, Dean Martin, the singer, the comedian, the entertainer who seemed to coast through his Western roles on charm and charisma, had been carrying skills that made Ford's best efforts look amateurish. "Dean," Ford said quietly, "with speed like that, you could be doing entirely different kinds of roles. Serious gunfighter pictures, action films. You could be the biggest Western star in Hollywood." Dean's expression grew thoughtful. "Glenn, I appreciate the compliment, but I like what I do. I make people happy. When I sing, people smile. When I tell jokes, they laugh. When I make movies, they're entertained. The quick draw thing, he gestured to his gun belt, that's just to make sure I'm competent at what the scripts call for. Competent, Ford repeated flatly. Dean, you just drew faster than any human being should be able to draw. That's not competent, that's superhuman. It's trained human, Dean corrected. Like a pianist who can play passages faster than normal people can think, or a dancer who can move in ways that seem impossible. The body can do remarkable things when you push it to its limits. As the crowd began to disperse, spreading word of what they'd witnessed throughout the studio, Ford found himself alone with Dean and a few members of his own crew. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the false storefronts, and the temperature was finally beginning to drop. I owe you an apology, Ford said finally. For what? For assuming I was in a different league from other actors. For implying that entertainers like you don't have the discipline for serious skills training. For being an arrogant ass. Dean smiled, and this time it was his familiar, warm entertainer smile. Glenn, you don't owe me anything. You've worked hard at this, you've achieved genuine skill, and you've brought authenticity to your roles. That's admirable. But you've worked harder and achieved, whatever the hell that was. I had some advantages, Dean said. Natural hand-eye coordination from music training, body control from stage performing, and maybe I just got lucky with genetics. But mostly I just practiced a lot and had good teachers. Ford was quiet for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what he'd learned. Dean, can I ask you something? Shoot. All those interviews where I talked about being the fastest gun in Hollywood, all those articles where I claimed my speed was unbeatable, you knew, didn't you? You knew you could draw twice as fast as me. Dean nodded. I knew. And you never said anything. You never corrected the record. Never tried to claim the title. Why would I? Your speed is genuinely impressive, and you earned your reputation through hard work and dedication. The fact that I might be a little faster doesn't diminish any of that. A little faster? Ford said with a bitter laugh. Dean, you just redefined what's humanly possible. You didn't just beat my time, you obliterated it. Dean put a hand on Ford's shoulder. Glenn, speed is just one element of what makes someone good in these roles. You bring knowledge, experience, authenticity to your westerns that can't be measured with a timer. Audiences believe you when you play a gunfighter because you understand the character, the history, the whole world these men lived in. But if anyone knew about your speed, then what? I become known as the fast draw guy instead of the entertainer. I get offered different kinds of roles, maybe make different kinds of movies. Dean shook his head. I like my career exactly as it is. The quick draw thing is a private satisfaction, not a public identity. As they walked back toward the main studio buildings, Ford found himself seeing Dean Martin in a completely different light. This wasn't just a colleague or fellow actor. This was quite possibly the most skilled quick-draw artist in the world, who preferred making people smile to making headlines. Dean, Ford said as they reached the parking area, would you mind showing me how you do it? Not to copy your technique, but just to understand it. I've been working on this for 15 years, and I feel like I'm just now realizing how much I don't know. Dean's expression grew serious. I'd be honored to help, Glenn, but you need to understand, what works for me might not work for you. We've got different builds, different natural abilities. I understand. I'm not trying to become you. I just want to learn from someone who's clearly mastered this at a level I never imagined possible. For the next hour, in the fading light of the California evening, Dean Martin gave Glenn Ford a masterclass in advanced quick-draw technique. He broke down his method, the precise positioning, the breathing exercises, the mental preparation that allowed him to move faster than human reflexes should permit. Ford was an eager student, and by the end of the session, he'd managed to improve his time by several hundredths of a second. Not enough to approach Dean's superhuman speed, but a significant improvement nonetheless. That was incredible, Ford said as they packed up their equipment. I learned more in the last hour than I did in the previous year of practice. You're already skilled, Glenn. You just needed to fine-tune the details. The foundation you've built over 15 years, that's solid work. As they prepared to part ways, Ford found himself reflecting on the afternoon's events. His identity as Hollywood's fastest gun might have been shattered, but something more valuable had taken its place. The understanding that true mastery often existed quietly, without fanfare or recognition. "Dean," he said as they reached their respective trailers. "Thank you, not just for the lesson but for the humility. You could have embarrassed me a lot worse than you did." Dean smiled. "Glenn, the only reason I demonstrated anything today was because you asked. I'm not in the business of embarrassing anyone. But when I was bragging about being the fastest, when I was implying that other actors didn't have real skills, you were proud of something you'd worked hard to achieve. That's natural. And your skills are real, they're just not the fastest in town." They shook hands, two professionals who had found a new level of mutual respect. Ford watched Dean walk to his car, still processing everything he'd witnessed. The next day, entertainment reporters would ask Ford about his practice session at Columbia. Word had spread that he'd been working on his quick draw with another actor. But Ford kept the details to himself. When pressed for specifics, he would only say, "I learned something important about the difference between being good at something and being the best at something. Sometimes the most skilled person in the room is the one you'd never suspect." Dean Martin, true to form, never spoke publicly about that afternoon either. When asked about his Western roles, he would deflect with jokes about how hard it was to look tough while humming show tunes. But in the small community of Western actors and stuntmen, the story spread quietly. Glenn Ford, known for his technical expertise and professional pride, let it be known that he'd seen something that changed his understanding of what was possible. And gradually, a new legend was born. Dean Martin wasn't just an entertainer who happened to do Westerns. He was quite possibly the fastest draw in human history, who simply preferred making people laugh to making them afraid. Years later, when Ford was asked about the most impressive display of skill he'd ever witnessed, he would always give the same answer. "Dean Martin, 1965, 1900ths of a second. I timed it myself, and it changed everything I thought I knew about what human beings are capable of." If you enjoyed this story from StorySphere, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of hidden talents and unexpected legends.